The bluebells are blooming again in Kingsbury Dell, gentle, silent things swaying over a soil that remembers too much. They say the valley is peaceful now, but the air still holds a hush, as though listening for the echo of a name once spoken in love and ended in guilt. Tonight's story takes us there, to a cottage half lost in ivy, a vicar burdened by conscience, and a river that keeps its secrets better than any grave. Before the fire burns too low, tell me, where in the world are you listening from, and what hour has found you in this moment? I'd love to know before we wander deeper into the mist. The lamps are dim, the night is waiting, and somewhere beyond the meadow, a truth long buried is about to rise. The mystery of the Bluebell widow begins. It was one of those tranquil spring mornings when even London seemed to breathe more gently, and the smoke that curled above the roofs of Baker Street had in it a softness that almost suggested innocence. Holmes sat opposite me in his armchair, legs drawn beneath him, his dressing gown falling loosely about his thin frame, while the steady hiss of his pipe marked the rhythm of his thoughts. The morning paper lay open across my knee. I had been reading aloud an account of a charitable exhibition at Kensington, but my companion appeared entirely indifferent to the world beyond his own reasoning. The golden light slanted across our sitting room, catching the glint of his instruments, the lean arch of his violin, and the heap of case papers that forever invaded my writing desk. All was still, save for the faint rattle of the city awakening. Holmes's eyes were half closed, yet I knew from the slight movement of his fingers upon the armrest that his mind was as alert as ever, waiting, as always, for the next summons to disturbance. It was just then that the bell sounded below, followed by the shuffle of Mrs. Hudson's brisk step upon the stair. A moment later, she entered with the Morning Post upon a tray. Holmes reached for it languidly, scattering several envelopes upon the table. Tradesmen's bills, circulars, and the usual minor irritants of domestic existence. Then his hand paused upon one particular envelope. It was addressed in a delicate but trembling hand. The ink faded unevenly, as though the writer's nerves had been at war with his conviction. "A clergyman's writing, Watson," said Holmes, holding it up to the light. "Note the spacing, habitual neatness distorted by distress." He slit it open with the paper knife and leaned back, his grey eyes scanning the page with that peculiar intensity which, even after years of acquaintance, never failed to fascinate me. "This," said Holmes at last, "comes from a certain Reverend Pemberley of Kingsbury Dell, a small parish in Sussex. Listen, Watson." And in his clear, level voice he began to read. "My dear Mr. Holmes, forgive the liberty I take in addressing you. A grievous event has lately occurred in our parish. The sudden death of Mrs. Eleanor Whitcomb, widow of the late Charles Whitcomb, once of the Bengal Engineers. She was found lifeless in her garden, having apparently fallen against a stone bench. Though the matter has been judged accidental by our local authorities, I confess a deep unease which will not let me rest. The lady was beloved by all, yet, strangely, mourned by few. I fear, Mr. Holmes, that some darker cause may lie behind what we are told was mischance. Should your duties permit, I beg you to come. Yours in earnest faith, Leonard Pemberley, Vicar of Kingsbury Dell." Holmes laid the letter upon the table and steepled his fingers. A widow beloved by all, but mourned by few. There, Watson, lies the seed of contradiction, and where contradiction grows, truth is often buried. He rose from his chair and began to pace the room, the tails of his dressing gown trailing like smoke behind him. "Consider the phrasing," he said thoughtfully. "The woman's character, painted in benevolence, yet evoking apathy and death. Why mourned by few? Because her virtue was more public than personal, or because she inspired gratitude without affection? I ventured that perhaps the villagers had tired of her piety." Holmes smiled faintly. "A reasonable supposition, my dear Watson, yet insufficient. Human indifference seldom stands alone. It grows from knowledge, and knowledge implies secrecy. There is something here of a moral dissonance. The good lady's death may have been deemed accidental, but I fancy it was far from ordinary." He paused at the window, tapping his long fingers upon the pane. Yes, he murmured, half to himself. A garden, a widow, a parish that whispers rather than grieves. We have, I think, the making of a most curious investigation. I could not but smile at the sudden quickening of my friend's manner. The languor that had settled upon him all morning seemed to dissolve like mist under the sun. He took down the worn copy of Bradshaw's Railway Guide and turned its leaves with the precision of a surgeon examining an organ. Kingsbury Dell, he said. 2 trains daily from Victoria, one at 7:30 in the morning. That shall serve us perfectly. He tossed the letter to me. There is more to this Reverend Pemberley's disquiet than simple clerical anxiety. Mark how he phrases his appeal. Beloved by all, yet mourned by few. The contradiction alone is invitation enough. As he spoke, he crossed to the mantel and replaced his pipe in its rack. Prepare yourself, Watson. We depart at dawn. There is something in this case that smells not of death, but of deception perfumed. Thus it was that our quiet spring morning ended, as so many of our days had begun, with a summons to the unknown. While Holmes busied himself with his chemical apparatus and a few scraps of notepaper, I packed our valises, reflecting upon how slight an impulse could once more draw us from the calm of Baker Street into the tangled affairs of the human heart. As the lamps of London flickered into life, Holmes turned from the window. Be ready by 6, Watson, he said quietly. Kingsbury Dell awaits, and with it, perhaps, the reason why one may be loved in life and unlamented in death. I saw the gleam in his eye, that spark of relentless curiosity, which, once kindled, no ordinary mystery could ever extinguish. And as the night deepened, I could not help but feel that our journey would lead us once again into the shadowed realm where innocence and guilt meet, and where Sherlock Holmes moved with unerring grace between the two. Our train left Victoria at 7:30, under a pale sky that promised the serenity of an English spring. The suburbs slipped away behind us, giving place to a gentle countryside clothed in new green and touched with drifting mist. I remember well the rhythmic clatter of the wheels, the faint perfume of damp earth through the open window, and Holmes seated opposite me, his head inclined in thought, his eyes half veiled yet watchful. He had scarcely spoken since our departure. A scrap of Reverend Pemberley's letter lay between his fingers, its edges worn soft by his handling. You observe, Watson, he said at last, how tragedy prefers quiet settings. A storm in London leaves no mark, but one in a peaceful valley echoes for years. I made no reply, knowing from experience that his mind had already leapt beyond mine into the tangle of conjecture that always preceded our investigations. The sunlight grew warmer as we sped southward. Fields of yellow gorse and the silver streak of a river glided past. Yet in Holmes's stillness there was something taut, the composure of a man waiting for discord to show its first note. It was nearing noon when the train slowed before a modest platform marked Kingsbury Dell. The little station, half hidden by lilac bushes, seemed scarcely large enough to warrant a name of its own. Beyond it, the valley opened like a bowl of green silence. Soft hills rising on every side, the air rich with the scent of grass and distant blooms. Holmes paused upon the platform, his keen grey eyes moving slowly from cottage roof to church spire, then to the meadows beyond. A place where one might live unseen, he murmured, and where truth, if it hides, may hide deeply indeed. We followed the single road into the heart of the village. It wound past a cluster of thatched houses, each with its neat garden and white gate, the very picture of English peace. And yet, though I could not have said why, there lingered upon that gentle scene a hush that felt unnatural, as though the valley itself withheld its voice. The villagers greeted us with courteous reserve, yet it was clear that our presence disturbed them. At the mention of Mrs. Whitcomb's name, conversation faltered and eyes slid away. I saw one old man touch his hat, mutter a prayer, and hurry off, down a lane without another word. Do you mark that, Watson? Holmes asked softly. They speak of the dead as though she might hear them still. At the small post office, where Holmes stopped to inquire after Reverend Pemberley's residence, the woman behind the counter whispered directions and added, "She was a good lady, sir, but there are those who say goodness draws its own shadow." Holmes thanked her gravely, his expression unreadable. As we moved on, the sound of a door closing behind us echoed in the still air. It was a quiet village, yet there was an edge to that quiet, a sense that grief had not departed, only buried itself deeper into the soil. We found Mrs. Whitcomb's cottage at the far end of the valley, where the lane narrowed into a meadow bright with bluebells. The house was a modest dwelling of stone and ivy, its thatched roof bowed slightly, as though humbled by time. The garden, still tended despite its mistress's absence, overflowed with early blossoms. A faint fragrance of earth and wildflowers clung about the place, that mingling of life and memory which marks a home recently bereaved. Holmes paused before the wicket gate, his gaze travelling from the neat beds of flowers to the shaded path leading toward the river. "Observe, Watson," he said quietly. "Nature's courtesy to the dead. She softens every outline." We stepped within. Through the curtained windows I glimpsed a tidy sitting room, a basket of mending still upon the chair, a book open on the table. The air seemed to hold its breath. I could almost imagine that at any moment the widow might return from her walk among the bluebells, smiling faintly. The past forgiven, but not forgotten. Holmes examined the garden with the care of one reading an unfamiliar script. His eyes rested briefly on a small stone bench beneath a yew tree before he turned away. "We shall come again when we know the language this garden speaks," he said, and we retraced our steps toward the village. The village inn, the Crown and Lark, stood at the corner of the green, a place of low beams, dark polish, and cautious hospitality. The landlord, a thick-set man with eyes as shrewd as a farmer's, greeted us civilly, but without warmth. Holmes engaged him with that genial indifference which so often concealed his purpose. "A melancholy affair," Holmes began over his glass of ale. "This poor lady's death, a blow to the village, no doubt." The landlord shrugged. "Aye, a good soul, Mrs. Whitcomb, kind to the children and generous to the poor. But she kept herself to herself of late, lonely, some thought." Holmes nodded thoughtfully. "Lonely, and yet not alone, perhaps?" The man glanced at him sidelong. "There was a stranger seen about her place, weeks before it happened. Pale fellow, kept to the river path. None knew his name. The missus said he was selling books." Holmes merely inclined his head. "A bookseller, you say? Remarkable, how commerce follows grief." And with that, he let the matter drop, though I could see that his interest had taken firm root. Later in the afternoon, we encountered a farmer's wife drawing water at the well. At Holmes's courteous inquiry, she confirmed what the landlord had said. A tall man he was, she told us, thin as a reed and foreign-looking, walked with Mrs. Whitcomb one evening by the meadow. She never smiled after that, poor soul. "Did he stay in the village?" Holmes asked. "Nay, sir, just vanished. Like mist after sunrise." She shook her head, lowering her voice. "But my boy swears he saw him again, watching from the wood on the night she died." Holmes thanked her, leaving her none the wiser as to how deeply that statement had struck him. We continued down the lane, the scent of bluebells drifting through the air, mingling with the faint smoke from cottage chimneys. For the first time, I saw Holmes's expression change, not to excitement, but to concentration so absolute it seemed to still the very air about him. "A man who vanishes and returns unseen, Watson, is a man who wishes to be known only by memory," he said at last. The sun had dipped behind the hills by the time we reached the crest above the village. Below us lay Kingsbury Dell, steeped in gold and violet haze, the meadows shimmering like a painted dream. Holmes stood beside me, his figure dark against the fading light. He remained silent for a long while, watching the smoke rise from the cottage chimneys. Then he said quietly, "Peace, when too perfect, conceals its own disturbance." Remember that, Watson. There was something in his tone that made me turn toward him, but he had already begun to walk down the slope, his coat brushing the long grass, his head bowed in thought. I followed in silence, for I too felt the first subtle stirring of unease. That faint, indefinable sense that we had stepped into a story still unfinished, and that its author had not yet laid down his pen. The following morning found us once more at the end of the narrow lane where Mrs. Whitcomb's cottage stood, withdrawn and quiet beneath a canopy of drifting cloud. A stillness hung over the little dwelling, not the serenity of peace, but the delicate hush that follows calamity. The curtains were half drawn as though to exclude the daylight. Ivy clung thickly to the walls, and the gate creaked mournfully as we entered. Even Holmes's tread seemed subdued upon the flagstones. The garden lay exactly as it had been left on the day of the widow's death, untouched and half overgrown. The faint hum of bees was the only sound, blending with the far-off toll of a church bell. "Observe, Watson," said Holmes quietly. "Nature, too, can be a conspirator. She grows her silence like ivy over a secret." I could not help but feel that the house itself listened. The widow's garden bore the unmistakable imprint of daily routine, the pattern of a mind, orderly and patient. Each flower bed was edged with care, the tools neatly stacked beneath the shed, and the gravel swept clean of debris. Yet near the far border, a small patch of earth seemed at odds with the rest, a square of soil disturbed more recently than the surrounding beds. Holmes crouched, pressing the loose dirt between his fingers. "Not by spade or paw," he murmured. "Too narrow for either." This was trodden lightly and with purpose. The faint impression of a boot heel glistened where dew still clung. And so, Watson, even the neatest life leaves room for interruption. We followed the garden path until we reached the shaded corner beneath a yew tree, where a weather-worn stone bench rested against the wall. It was there, as Constable Harrow had informed us, that Mrs. Whitcomb had been found lifeless, her head struck upon the very edge. A stray bluebell, half crushed, still lay by the seat, and near it a broad-brimmed hat, faded with age. Holmes bent over them with quiet reverence, as though the inanimate objects might yet yield their lament. "She sat here often," I said. "The mark of her heel is worn into the ground." "Indeed," Holmes replied, "and yet observe, the impression lies upon the left, while the fall was to the right. That, Watson, is the beginning of a conversation the dead may still conduct." Constable Harrow awaited us by the gate, a solid, sunburnt fellow with the good-humoured obstinacy of the rural law. "Sad business, gentlemen," he declared, touching his helmet. "A fine lady, God rest her. Poor footing, that's what it was. The flagstones, slick with moss, slipped, struck her head on the bench, and never rose again." Holmes listened with impeccable courtesy, his hands clasped behind him, his eyes half closed. "No robbery, I trust?" "None, sir. Purse still in her apron. Doctor signed it natural. Well, accidental." Holmes inclined his head gravely. "I envy the tranquillity of your conclusions, Constable. It must make for very restful nights." The man blinked, uncertain whether he had been praised or mocked. I caught the faint twitch at the corner of Holmes's mouth, that subtle sign of his growing certainty. When Harrow departed, Holmes turned his attention to a narrow wooden gate at the rear, leading from the garden into the adjoining meadow. Its latch was fastened from within, yet the earth directly beneath showed clear evidence of disturbance, a narrow trail of crushed grass leading outward. "Curious," he murmured. "A gate locked from the inside, yet recently used." He produced his magnifying lens and examined the threshold. "Note the heel mark, Watson. Not broad enough for a woman's shoe, nor flat as a labourer's. A man's boot with a foreign cut, narrow and high." I stooped beside him, tracing the faint outline he indicated. "Then someone entered after her death?" Holmes shook his head. "Or before it, but not without her knowledge." The tone in his voice was quiet, almost grave, as though he had brushed the edge of truth and found it cold. We returned to the yew's shadow. Holmes's eye fell once more upon the stone seat, and he drew his magnifying glass from his pocket. With infinite care he touched the surface, then held his fingertip to the light. Ash, he said simply. Cigar ash, pale grey, coarse grain, Havana quality. I glanced at the cottage windows. Surely none of the villagers would. Precisely. No rustic habit this. Mrs. Whitcomb was a woman of refinement. She would not have tolerated tobacco near her flowers. Holmes gathered several flecks into an envelope. Ash, my dear Watson, is the signature of indolence. A man pauses to smoke only when he feels secure in his intrusion. He stood for a moment, regarding the quiet garden. A seat of peace, yet marked by arrogance, an uninvited guest who sat too long. Holmes replaced his lens and straightened, the faintest glint returning to his eye. Accidents rarely pause to smoke, he murmured. Nor do they trouble to lock gates behind them. No, Watson, this is no misstep of chance. The pattern is deliberate, an entry, a meeting, and an exit concealed. He slipped the envelope of ash into his pocket and turned toward the house. We shall speak with the housekeeper presently. Her recollection may furnish the shadow behind the scene. As we left the garden, I glanced back once more at the empty bench beneath the yew. The crushed flowers, the silence, the faint trace of smoke lingering in the still air, all seemed to whisper of unseen trespass. And though I could not yet follow the thread my companion had grasped, I felt, with growing unease, that the tranquil beauty of Kingsbury Dell concealed something far more disquieting than death. We were received at the cottage by Mrs. Dorr, a thin, tremulous woman whose appearance seemed woven from the same faded fabric as the house itself. Her hands, red and unsteady, twisted a corner of her apron, and her eyes, pale, watery things, betrayed both devotion and dread. She curtsied awkwardly before us, murmuring that she had long expected someone of consequence to call. Holmes spoke to her with that peculiar gentleness he reserved for those on the edge of grief. You served Mrs. Whitcomb for many years, I believe. Since before the master was lost, sir. 20 years come Michaelmas. Her voice quavered. She was a good lady, though sorrow wore her down something awful. Never complained, but I saw it. The weight that don't leave a widow's shoulders. Holmes nodded gravely. You will help us, Mrs. Dorr, by remembering what others have chosen to forget. In the dimness of the sitting room, where the curtains half muted the afternoon light, the old housekeeper's tale unfolded in fragments. The scent of old smoke still clung to the hearth, and upon the mantel stood a silver-framed likeness of the late Mrs. Whitcomb, serene, composed, and faintly sorrowful. She changed, sir, in the last month, Mrs. Dorr began. Took to sitting here long after midnight, never speaking, just staring at the fire till it burned to grey. More than once I found her feeding the flames with letters, good paper, thick, not like what we keep for common use. She'd burn them one by one, her face pale as milk. When I asked her what they were, she said, "Old debts, Mrs. Dorr, old debts of the heart." Holmes's eyes flickered to the grate, where a few charred fragments still lay. And she was alone in this? Always, sir. Alone and frightened, though she'd never admit as much. Mrs. Dorr clasped her hands together, as though to still their trembling. It was the voice that broke her peace, sir. You see, our cottage stands close to the river path. On still nights, when the wind came soft, she'd start sudden, saying she heard someone calling her name from the water. Not a shout, more like a man's voice carried by the mist. Eleanor, it would say. Always that. Eleanor. The poor woman paused to wipe her eyes. At first I thought it fancy. The mind plays tricks on them that grieve. But once, I swear it, I heard it too, low and far off, as if the river itself spoke with a man's breath. She went to the window, trembling so that I feared she'd swoon, and whispered, "It's his voice, Mrs. Dorr. He's come back for me." Holmes leaned forward slightly. "And did she ever seek the river?" "Not she, sir. She barred the door and prayed till morning. In the weeks that followed, Mrs. Dawes said, the widow's composure withered by degrees. Her appetite failed. Her step grew light, as if she feared to disturb the air. At dusk, she locked her chamber door and would allow no one to enter till morning. She said it was better so, the servant whispered, glancing toward the staircase, that some things are safest behind locks. Yet when I'd take her tea, I'd hear her moving about, quick and quiet, like one hiding something. Once I found her standing in the passage, candle in hand, her face white as death. She looked at me as though she didn't know me. Then she said, "Oh, I'll never forget it. Mrs. Dawes, if I should die suddenly, tell no one what you've seen." Holmes regarded the trembling woman with grave compassion. You did well to remember, even if you did not understand. When Holmes asked if Mrs. Whitcomb had kept any private papers or possessions, the housekeeper hesitated. Her hands twisted more violently in her apron. "There is one thing, sir. A little iron box beneath the bed. The mistress never let me touch it. Said it held her final arrangements, though I never knew what that meant. I couldn't bring myself to open it after she passed." Holmes's expression softened. "You need not fear, Mrs. Dawes. The dead resent neither truth nor justice." She fetched the box from the upper chamber, a small rusted thing bound with a simple clasp. Holmes examined it briefly, then produced his penknife and sprung the catch. Inside lay a folded sheet of paper and a yellowed photograph, their surfaces faintly scented of lavender and decay. Mrs. Dawes crossed herself softly, whispering, "God forgive me for what's inside." Holmes unfolded the paper with care. It proved to be an unsigned will, the handwriting unsteady, blotted as though penned in haste. The contents were simple. Mrs. Whitcomb bequeathed her estate to the parish and the poor of Kingsbury Dell. But beneath that, in a trembling scrawl, were the words, "To be witnessed upon his return." "The will of a woman who waited," Holmes murmured. He then turned to the photograph. It was the portrait of a man in uniform, the collar marked with the insignia of the Bengal Engineers. The face was long and austere, the eyes piercingly alive despite the faded print. Even I, no expert in human expression, felt the unnerving vitality of that gaze. "That's him, sir," said Mrs. Dawes faintly. "The master, Captain Whitcomb. Lost in the river near Calcutta 10 years ago. The papers said he drowned, but she never believed it. She said the river only borrowed him." Holmes studied the photograph in silence, the corners of his mouth tightening almost imperceptibly. The light from the window caught the glassy surface, casting a faint reflection across his face. "Mrs. Dawes," he said at length, "I fear your mistress's faith was rewarded in a manner most cruel." She looked bewildered. "You mean, sir?" "This man," Holmes said softly, tapping the image, "did not drown so thoroughly as his obituary would suggest." A long silence followed. The housekeeper pressed her handkerchief to her lips, as though to stifle a cry. Holmes replaced the contents of the box, his expression unreadable. "Watson," he said, "I believe our next inquiry must begin not with the living, but with the man whom the river returned." A shiver passed through me, though the hearth fire burned warm. For in that moment, I felt the shadow of the case deepen, as if the dead themselves had stirred to listen. Our lodgings were secured at a modest inn upon the village green, a house of low ceilings, time-blackened beams, and the scent of wood smoke that clung like a memory to every corner. The public room was dim but welcoming, its hearth throwing a wavering glow across pewter mugs and worn oak tables. Conversation fluttered in low tones among the few patrons, yet it faltered perceptibly when the landlord uttered our names. Holmes's presence was of a kind that disturbed the surface of any company, no matter how placid. He carried with him that unmistakable air of inquiry, the look of a man who could not sit among strangers without seeing through them. As we took our places by the fire, I noted the sideways glances the whisper that rustled and died. In that small circle of villagers, curiosity and fear were close cousins. Our supper was served, plain fare of roast mutton and ale, and, as often occurred, Holmes's silence invited others to speak. The landlord, a stout man of good cheer until the subject changed, began to recount, half reluctantly, the story of Captain Charles Whitcomb. "It was 10 years ago come spring," he said, lowering his voice. "The captain's boat was found drifting near the bend of the river. No sign of him anywhere, only his coat caught in the reeds. They searched for days, but the current keeps its dead close, sir. The widow never ceased to walk the meadows, poor soul, waiting for him to rise." I glanced toward Holmes, whose eyes remained fixed upon the leaping flames. "You say the body was never found?" he asked quietly. "Never, sir. And when a thing's never found, it never rests." The man crossed himself almost imperceptibly, and the hum of the room grew still again. It was then that I noticed a solitary figure seated apart in the farthest corner, a lean, scholarly man with a stoop of the shoulders and a mild pallor that suggested frailty or solitude. He was surrounded by a modest stack of books, which he turned over idly with long, delicate fingers. His dress was neat, though his cuffs were frayed, and beside him rested a worn leather satchel. "Mr. Hale, the bookseller," the landlord murmured in answer to my inquiry. "Travels the county, dealing in old volumes and prints, keeps himself to himself." Holmes's gaze followed mine, though he made no comment. There was a certain symmetry in the man's profile that caught the eye, something unremarkable until studied too long. The stranger did not join the conversation, nor look up when the name Whitcomb was mentioned, but I saw his fingers hesitate upon a page. Holmes appeared wholly absorbed in the movement of the firelight, yet I knew that his glance had fixed upon the bookseller with the quiet precision of a rifleman taking aim. From the shadow where we sat, he observed the man's every motion, the set of his jaw, the arch of his brow, the sharp, deep line between the eyes. I remembered the photograph found in Mrs. Whitcomb's iron box, and a tremor passed through me as recognition dawned. The likeness was unmistakable. Allowing for the passage of years, the face of the supposed drowned man, Charles Whitcomb, now sat before us, turning a yellowed page beneath the flicker of the fire. "Watson," Holmes murmured so softly that only I could hear. The dead, it seems, have an inconvenient habit of resurfacing when the tide of conscience turns. I dared not answer, for the strange quiet of that room felt suddenly like the stillness before a confession. Holmes rose at last and crossed to the man with the easy courtesy that cloaked his sharpest intent. "Mr. Hale, if I am not mistaken," he began, offering the faintest inclination of the head. "A fine collection you have there. May I?" The bookseller looked up, startled, yet quickly masked his surprise with a polite smile. "Certainly, sir. Old sermons and atlases mostly, not of much consequence." His voice was steady, but his hand trembled slightly as he turned a page. Holmes seated himself opposite, his manner perfectly unthreatening. "You are not local, I gather?" "No, I pass through on business. I prefer quiet places." He dabbed his brow with a handkerchief, glancing toward the darkened window as though uneasy with the gathering night. Holmes's eyes softened, but I saw the flicker of pursuit beneath them. When the man's fingers brushed the matchbox beside him, they lingered as if seeking reassurance, a nervous gesture that betrayed a far deeper unrest. Holmes's tone became conversational, almost indulgent. "I confess a fondness for obscure publications," he said lightly, "particularly those concerning navigation and rivers. The old journals of the Royal Engineers, for instance. They contain fascinating studies on currents, eddies, and their peculiar effects upon small craft." At that remark, Mr. Hale's composure faltered. His hand froze mid-motion. The colour drained from his cheeks. He attempted a weak smile. "Indeed, sir, I cannot claim any such expertise." "Ah," said Holmes, gently tapping the ash from his pipe. "Yet I thought I detected in your accent the faint trace of Bengal service, though perhaps I was mistaken." The man's eyes flashed with sudden alarm, then lowered quickly. "You are mistaken," he said curtly, gathering his books. "Good evening, gentlemen." Holmes bowed with the faintest smile. "Good evening, Captain." The title fell so quietly that even I doubted whether I had heard it, but Mr. Hale did not. His fingers clenched around the satchel strap, and his retreat was swift, almost stumbling, through the door that led to the stair. When the public room had emptied and the embers glowed low, we retired to the narrow passage that led to our adjoining chambers. Holmes stood for a while, with the lamp turned low, his expression thoughtful rather than triumphant. "Watson," he said softly, "a man may change his name, his trade, even his conscience, but never his reflex. Fear leaves its own handwriting." I was on the verge of reply when a faint sound reached us from beyond the thin wall. A murmur of voices, one belonging unmistakably to the landlord, the other low and urgent, Mr. Hale's. Holmes raised a finger for silence. Through the stillness came the man's pleading tone, the words distinct enough to chill the blood. "Have the horse ready at dawn. Before the mists rise. I'll be gone before the village stirs." Holmes extinguished the lamp. In the darkness, I heard him whisper, "The river's mists, Watson. They conceal much, but they reveal more to those who wait." And I knew from the measured calm of his voice that dawn would not find Captain Whitcomb alone upon the road. The following morning dawned pale and still, with a mist that lingered like breath upon the hedgerows. Holmes and I made our way once more to the late Mrs. Whitcomb's cottage. The shutters stood half open, as though reluctant to admit the day. The air within retained that faint mingling of dust and lavender, peculiar to unoccupied houses, but beneath it lay another odour, subtle, acrid, the ghost of burnt matter. Holmes paused upon the threshold and drew in a slow breath. "You perceive it, Watson. Smoke, not of wood, but of something delicate, organic." His tone carried that quiet satisfaction I had come to recognize, the scent of truth beneath the perfume of mystery. The grate still held a crust of grey ash. It seemed that Mrs. Whitcomb's final vigil by the hearth had ended not with prayer, but with destruction. Holmes knelt before the fireplace, his long fingers sifting gently through the powdery residue. The light from the window fell upon his sharp profile, throwing into relief the precision of thought that guided every motion. "What do you make of this, Watson?" he asked without looking up. I joined him beside the hearth, and together we examined the remnants, grey ash mottled with flecks of pale blue and faint, fibrous strands. Holmes handled them with the tenderness of a jeweller weighing pearls. "Not paper," he said softly, "nor fabric. Observe the structure, membranous, yet organic." He spread a few fragments upon a sheet of white paper, his eyes narrowing. "There is method here. This was no careless fire." A subtle change came over his expression, not surprise, but the quiet click of a puzzle piece falling into place. My medical training lent me some modest knowledge of natural forms, and as I studied the fragments, I felt a sudden conviction. "Holmes," I said, "these are not ashes of correspondence. Look, the fine veins, the papery texture, these are petals." Holmes inclined his head approvingly. "Indeed, Watson. And from what flower, would you suppose?" I turned one brittle scrap between my fingers. "Bluebell, perhaps. The colour lingers even in ruin." "Excellent. It seems you have not allowed London practice to dull your observation." He smiled faintly. "Our widow, then, did not burn letters, but blossoms. The question is, why?" The thought was singularly disquieting. What memory, what message, could have been so painful that a woman chose to consign not words, but flowers, to the flame? Holmes bent closer to the hearthstone. "Ah, there lies the remainder of her confession." He touched a spot of faint yellow dust that shimmered when the light struck it obliquely. Pollen, bluebell pollen, unburned. He regarded it as one might a signature at the end of a letter. "See, Watson, how it clings to the edge of the stone, untouched by the heat. This was deliberate, not accidental. The flowers were fresh when they burned. Their pollen, fine as gilt, escaped the flame. A curious mercy. He brushed a few grains onto a scrap of paper and folded it neatly. Our widow received something hidden in those blossoms, something she dared not keep. She destroyed the token, yet the trace remains, as it always does, whether upon stone or conscience. I watched him in silence, feeling that we stood in the presence of some fragile but terrible truth. Holmes's gaze travelled from the hearth to the window, where the curtains stirred faintly in the morning air. Consider, Watson, flowers freshly gathered, their stems untrimmed. They were sent, not bought. The gift was familiar to her, else she would never have burned it herself. Within those bluebells lay something, a note, perhaps, whose words she feared to preserve. He turned toward me, his eyes keen yet sorrowful. Mrs. Whitcomb did not burn the flowers from sentiment, but from necessity. She knew the hand that gathered them, and the peril that hand carried, a message too personal for the police, too dangerous for prayer. He looked again at the ashes. Had it been simple correspondence, she would have hidden it. But flowers, Watson, they perish quickly, and with them, memory, unless one intends memory to die. As Holmes spoke, the scene before me seemed to shift from mere evidence to tragedy. I could imagine the widow kneeling where we now stood, the flame rising and falling as she fed it the tokens of her torment. She was not wicked, I said quietly, only frightened. Holmes gave a grave nod. Yes, the fear of a woman who loves too deeply or forgives too easily. She burned the flowers not to save herself, but someone else. Perhaps the sender, perhaps the dead. The faint wind stirred the ashes. Holmes rose, brushing the dust from his knees. It is the commonest of motives, Watson, yet the least understood, the sacrifice of truth for affection. When conscience wars with tenderness, the battlefield is silence. I could not reply. The little hearth, with its handful of grey dust, seemed to me a monument to that silence. Holmes stood at the window, his profile outlined against the pale sky. His voice, when he spoke, was low and meditative. There are crimes of silence, Watson, as grave as those of violence. A lie may be spoken in words, but it may also be kept in the heart. I suspect our widow carried hers for years. He turned to me. Mark the refinement of her concealment. No weapon, no confession, merely flowers and flame. She burned the truth, thinking it would die with her. But truth, like pollen, is tenacious. It lingers in the air long after the bloom is gone. I felt, as I often did in such moments, the strange mingling of awe and sadness his insight inspired, that rare blend of intellect and pity which made his deductions less like judgments than elegies. Holmes stooped once more and stirred the ash with his penknife. A small fragment of paper emerged, not wholly consumed, its edge charred but the centre intact. He held it to the light. Upon it, written in a hand faint yet unmistakable, were the words, "The river knows." The river, Holmes repeated softly. So the past is not buried after all. Our drowned man sends messages from the current. He folded the scrap and slipped it into his pocketbook. Watson, prepare yourself. We shall revisit that gentle watercourse this afternoon. There is knowledge in its depths, and perhaps something less forgiving. He closed the grate and drew the curtains half shut. The dead have spoken once already, he murmured. It remains to see whether the living will answer. And as we stepped out into the pale light of Kingsbury Dell, I felt that the calm of the valley was but the calm before revelation. It was shortly after breakfast when the landlord entered our private parlour at the inn, bearing an envelope upon a small tray. Its neat handwriting, modest yet firm, marked it as clerical, and the seal of Kingsbury Dell parish left little doubt as to its sender. Holmes broke the seal with his habitual precision and glanced at the contents. "A request, Watson," he said, and phrased with the delicacy of one accustomed to moral entanglements rather than criminal ones. The note, penned by Reverend Pemberley, implored that we call upon him at our earliest convenience and in strict confidence. Holmes folded the letter with care. "The conscience of the clergy," he remarked dryly, "is rarely idle. Come, Watson. I fancy this summons may take us deeper into the widow's story than her grave has yet allowed." We set off toward the vicarage, the morning air cool and tremulous with birdsong, yet heavy with foreboding. Reverend Pemberley received us in a dim study lined with sermons and faded theological volumes. The room smelt faintly of damp paper and dying flowers. Through the half-drawn curtains filtered a pale light that seemed to render the vicar's face almost spectral in its weariness. He was a man in late middle age, with silvered hair and the air of one long accustomed to solitude. His hands, folded upon his desk, trembled as he greeted us. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, you must forgive my intrusion upon your morning. I have prayed for guidance, and it seems Providence has sent it in your form." Holmes inclined his head with quiet gravity. "We are here to listen, Reverend. Speak as freely as you would to your own conscience." At that, the vicar's composure wavered. He pressed a handkerchief to his brow, as if the weight of confession had already begun its descent upon him. For some moments, the vicar remained silent, gazing at the small crucifix upon his desk. When at last he spoke, his voice was low and halting, touched with shame. "I must begin, Mr. Holmes, with a sin not of deed but of thought. Many years ago, before sorrow had touched her, I loved Mrs. Whitcomb." He lifted his eyes to us, steady now, though filled with sadness. "She was then Eleanor Bexley, the daughter of a colonel, far above my humble position. I never spoke of it, nor did she ever suspect. Yet when she married Captain Whitcomb and came to this parish, I found that affection, long buried, had taken root in silence." He gave a small, despairing sigh. "I tell you this not for pity, but because no truth is complete without its beginning. My folly was harmless enough in youth, but it became the seed of greater error later in life." The vicar's fingers tightened upon the edge of his desk as he continued. "After the captain's death, or supposed death, as I now fear, Mrs. Whitcomb was left in desperate straits. Her husband's affairs were entangled beyond redemption. Creditors threatened. The house might have been seized. She was proud, Mr. Holmes, too proud to ask for aid." He paused, struggling for composure. "I did what I believed mercy demanded. I diverted a small portion of parish funds, in the name of another benefactor, to ease her circumstances. It was wrong, though meant in kindness. No one ever knew. She accepted it gratefully, believing the gift came from her husband's regiment." The man's voice faltered. "I thought the matter buried. But God does not forget what man conceals, even when concealment wears the guise of compassion." Holmes said nothing, but his attentive stillness seemed to absorb every word. "Some weeks before her death," the vicar went on, "a stranger came to the vicarage seeking her address. A pale, scholarly man who spoke with the faintest trace of the colonies, courteous, but with eyes that never smiled. He claimed to have served with Captain Whitcomb and hinted that he possessed certain knowledge concerning the widow's finances. Later, she came to me in great distress. The same man had visited her, alleging that he knew of my deception, that I had misused parish charity for her benefit. He demanded money in exchange for silence, threatening to ruin us both." His voice grew faint. "She swore to me she had paid him nothing, but I saw the terror in her eyes. She said only, 'He knows too much, and speaks as one risen from the grave.'" Holmes's expression did not change, but his eyes gleamed like a flint catching light. Reverend Pemberley clasped his trembling hands. "When she was found dead, I knew that I was, in part, her murderer. My foolish secrecy, my attempt to play Providence, it made her prey to this impostor. Her conscience was too gentle to bear the burden alone." He rose suddenly, pacing the narrow carpet. I am not concerned for my own reputation, Mr. Holmes. My parish may turn against me. I shall accept it. But I beg you, discover the truth of this man's identity. If he was indeed an agent of blackmail, let the world know it. If he was something worse, then may justice, not mercy, attend him. His voice broke, and he sank back into his chair, his face buried in his hands. The silence that followed was heavy with the mingled sense of dust and remorse. Holmes stepped forward and placed a hand lightly upon the vicar's shoulder, an uncharacteristic gesture of compassion. Reverend, he said softly, the line between sin and virtue is often drawn by circumstance rather than intention. Guilt and innocence are but different shades of the same burden when the heart means kindly. The clergyman looked up, startled by the gentleness of the tone. You must not carry the full weight of this, Holmes continued. You gave in charity, not deceit. It was another who profited from your virtue's shadow. That man, whether living or damned, will not escape the truth. He turned to me then, his expression sharpened once more to steel. Come, Watson, we have heard the confession of conscience. It remains to hear the confession of fact. The river knows, and we shall let it speak. As we left the vicarage, I saw the Reverend sink to his knees before the darkened hearth, a man praying not for forgiveness, but for forgetfulness. Holmes and I found Mr. Hale, if that was indeed his name, in his modest lodgings above the saddler's shop near the village green. The small room bore the marks of a man perpetually ready to flee, a half-packed valise upon the chair, papers hastily tied with twine, and a single candle burning, though the hour was still bright. Holmes seated himself without invitation, while I stood by the window, conscious of the man's effort to appear composed. Yet under Holmes's steady gaze, that composure quivered visibly. You have been preparing for a journey, Mr. Hale, said Holmes evenly. May I presume it is not a pleasure excursion? The man's lips parted, but no answer came. His hands gripped the back of the chair until the knuckles whitened. I do not understand your meaning, he stammered. Holmes's smile was gentle, almost pitying. On the contrary, sir, you understand it perfectly. For a moment there was only the sound of the clock upon the mantel, marking each second with merciless precision. Then the man gave a strangled sigh, sank into the chair and covered his face with his hands. You know then, he said hoarsely. You have known from the beginning. Holmes inclined his head slightly. It was not difficult. The resemblance between yourself and Captain Charles Whitcomb was too precise for coincidence. Add to that your reaction to certain references. The river, the Bluebells, the vicarage, and the mask, I fear, could not endure. Slowly, the man lowered his hands. Yes, he said with weary resignation. I am Charles Whitcomb. I did not die, though perhaps I should have. 10 years of shame and exile are punishment enough for any sin short of murder. Let us not presume degrees of guilt before truth has been fully told, Holmes replied. You will oblige us, Captain, by recounting what led you to abandon both your name and your wife. Whitcomb's face was ashen, yet his voice, once steadied, carried the tone of a man long oppressed by silence. You must understand, gentlemen, I was ruined. Speculation, reckless, dishonourable, left me penniless. Worse, the regiment was on the verge of discovery. To face a court-martial, public disgrace, imprisonment, I had not the courage. He paused, his eyes fixed upon the fire. The river seemed a merciful judge. My boat was found overturned, my coat adrift. I walked away from the water that night and never returned. Under the name of Henry Hale, I made a new life in Bristol. Humble, quiet, unworthy perhaps, but free. And your wife? Holmes asked softly. Whitcomb's voice faltered. I wrote once, unsigned. I thought she would marry again, find happiness. I believed her too proud to mourn a coward. Holmes's gaze remained fixed upon him, yet his expression betrayed nothing. And yet you came back. Whitcomb's fingers twisted the brim of his hat as he spoke. Word reached me, through an old acquaintance, that my wife had inherited property, the cottage, the meadow, the land beyond. I swear to you, sir, it was not greed that drew me. I wished only to see her once more, to ask forgiveness, and perhaps to share in that peace I had forfeited. Holmes's brow lifted slightly. Forgiveness and fortune have ever been twin temptations, Captain. The man's eyes flashed with sudden pain. You wrong me, sir. I meant her no harm. I came to her openly, without deceit. I told her who I was, and begged her to hear me. Watson's heart stirred with reluctant pity, for in the trembling of his hands and the hollowness of his eyes, there lingered the wreckage of a man once proud. She received you, then? Holmes asked quietly. Whitcomb hesitated. For a time. He spoke now with the tremor of recollection, his voice lowered as though afraid of what his own memory might reveal. It was in the garden, near sunset. She had been gathering bluebells. When she saw me, she went pale, as if the river itself had risen before her. I pleaded, for one word of kindness, for one chance to prove I was changed. His fingers clenched the chair. She would not hear me. Her words were gentle but final. She said I had forfeited her heart as surely as I had my honour. She bade me go, and never darken her gate again. Whitcomb's breath came unsteadily. I swear, gentlemen, she was alive when I left her. I walked away by the meadow path. I never looked back. Holmes regarded him closely, his face impassive, save for the faint tightening at the corner of his mouth. And yet, within the hour, she was dead. Holmes allowed a silence to stretch, not the silence of contemplation, but of silent pressure. The ticking clock grew loud in that narrow room. You tell your tale with commendable fluency, Holmes said at length. It bears all the marks of long rehearsal. Whitcomb lifted his head sharply. You doubt me, then? I neither doubt nor believe, Holmes returned. I observe. From my place by the window, I saw that familiar, almost imperceptible gleam light Holmes's grey eyes. The same gleam I had noted when truth hovered near the surface, waiting only for his touch to break through. He leaned forward slightly. One thing more, Captain. When you left the garden, how was the weather? Whitcomb hesitated. Still, very still, he murmured. The air smelled of rain. Holmes's eyes narrowed a fraction, though his voice remained calm. Indeed. Holmes rose suddenly and crossed to the mantel, turning his back upon the man. His tone, when he spoke, was deceptively casual. It is curious, Captain, how certain details imprint themselves upon memory, the bench beneath the yew tree, for instance. It must have been there she sat when you spoke. Whitcomb froze. His lips parted, but no sound emerged. Holmes turned, his gaze keen as the blade of a scalpel. You see, that small fact was never mentioned in the police report, nor spoken by any witness. Only the murderer could know where she sat. The man's voice broke. You cannot prove. Holmes's voice cut across him, soft yet final. Proof is a luxury, Captain. Truth is not. You betrayed yourself when you named the place. Whitcomb staggered back, his hand gripping the mantel. I did not mean to harm her. She taunted me, called me a ghost, said she would expose my fraud to the world. I struck out, only to silence her. And she fell. His voice dropped to a whisper. I never meant. Holmes's eyes were as cold as stone. Few men ever do. The confession hung in the air like smoke from a spent flame. Whitcomb sank into the chair, his shoulders bowed under the weight of his ruin. For a moment, Holmes regarded him in silence, then moved to the door and opened it. Constable, he said quietly. Two uniformed men entered. Their boots echoed upon the bare floor. Whitcomb did not resist. He rose slowly, his gaze distant, as if already seeing beyond the narrow confines of the room. As they led him away, Holmes spoke softly, more to himself than to any listener. The river may forgive, but memory does not. Guilt, once awakened, returns to claim its own. We watched from the window as the small procession crossed the green and vanished into the mist. Holmes stood motionless, his profile outlined against the light. "It is a curious thing, Watson," he said at last. "Some men drown once and are forgotten. Others resurface, only to discover that death was the kinder choice." And with that, he turned away, his face unreadable, and began methodically to fill his pipe. The morning that followed Whitcomb's arrest broke with a subdued stillness over Kingsbury Dell, as though the valley itself recoiled from the memory of human passion. The bells of the small parish church tolled not for service, but in a melancholy rhythm that seemed to echo the whispers moving from door to door. Women lingered at their gates, speaking in hushed tones, while the blacksmith paused his hammering to listen for distant tidings from the constable's office. It was not joy that stirred among them, but pity, a quiet mourning that blurred the line between sinner and victim. Holmes and I passed unnoticed along the lane, save for a curt nod from the innkeeper. Even the birds seemed reluctant to sing. "Strange, Watson," Holmes murmured. "There are villages where gossip feeds upon tragedy, and others, like this one, where it starves upon it." I could only agree. The peace of Kingsbury Dell had turned to a silence more dreadful than lamentation. By midday, we were once more within the vicarage, where Reverend Pemberley awaited us, pale and trembling, yet eager for understanding. Holmes stood before him, one hand upon the back of a chair, the other resting lightly in his pocket, the familiar pose of a man about to close a case, not with triumph, but with gravity. "In every tragedy, Reverend," he began, "there is a moment when compassion and deception intersect. The late Mrs. Whitcomb lived upon that line. You concealed her husband's disgrace, she concealed his guilt, and together those mercies became the seed of her ruin." His voice was calm, yet each word fell with the precision of a judge pronouncing sentence. Step by step, he unfolded the chain, the imposture, the meeting in the garden, the quarrel that ended in death, the panic, and the futile attempt to flee. When he finished, the vicar sank into his chair, his face buried in his hands. "God forgive us all," he whispered. Holmes made no reply. Mercy, he knew, was beyond his jurisdiction. Holmes's tone softened as he continued his account. She met him by appointment, near sunset. It was not fear that brought her, but conscience. She meant to offer forgiveness, but not renewal. When she saw the man who had deserted her, time itself seemed to stand between them. 10 years of grief, 10 years of strength. She told him, I believe, that her life was now her own, that she would not return to the shadow he had left her in. He pleaded, perhaps sincerely, perhaps not, spoke of her inheritance, of his shame, of wanting only a chance to begin again. She refused him. Her words were final, not cruel, but resolute. It was not wealth she denied him, but the right to haunt her peace. She had forgiven him as a Christian, but not as a wife. Holmes looked toward the vicar. That, Reverend, was the true absolution she intended. The quarrel, Holmes went on, was brief but fatal. He had borne humiliation before, but never from her lips. The very gentleness of her refusal struck deeper than anger could have done. When she turned away, his temper, long suppressed, flared into madness. He seized her arm, imploring her to listen. She tried to draw back. He pushed her aside, not in malice, but in reckless passion. Her foot caught upon the uneven stones. She fell against the garden bench. The edge of the stone struck her temple. There was no cry, no struggle, only silence. I felt a chill as Holmes spoke the words, though his voice never rose above its calm cadence. He knelt beside her, called her name, found no answer. And then the terror came. The coward's instinct of flight. He fled through the meadow, leaving behind the flowers she had gathered for his grave. His path, said Holmes, was written upon the earth itself. The crushed stems of bluebells marked each desperate stride. He stumbled once, there, near the hollow where the river bends, and dropped what she had carried in her hands. Those same blossoms were later found upon her gown, mingled with the dust of the path. In the darkness, he made for the road, thinking only of concealment. By dawn, he had resumed the guise of Henry Hale, the quiet bookseller. Yet his peace was gone. The river that had once sheltered his deceit now seemed to murmur accusation. It was not conscience that betrayed him, Watson. It was remembrance. His every step in Kingsbury Dell led him closer to the place where his soul had drowned. Holmes's voice fell to a murmur, and so it was not I who discovered him. It was the river itself. Later that day, Whitcomb sat once more before us, a man hollowed of all pretense. There was no bravado, no protestation, only that peculiar quiet which comes after truth has stripped the spirit bare. Holmes spoke with neither scorn nor pity. "You need not speak further, Captain. The facts suffice." But the man shook his head. "No, Mr. Holmes. I must speak, if only to tell you that she forgave me. Even as she fell, there was forgiveness in her eyes. That is what breaks me, not the law, not the gallows, but her mercy." His voice trembled, and tears gathered unashamedly in his eyes. "She kept my name untainted. I shall bear hers to my death." Holmes bowed his head slightly. "It is just," he said. "There are prisons built not of stone, but of remembrance. You shall not leave yours." That evening, as dusk crept across the valley, Holmes and I walked to the riverbank. The water lay still beneath the willow boughs, reflecting the faint gold of the sinking sun. Not a ripple stirred the surface, save where a solitary leaf drifted past. Holmes stood long in silence, his hands clasped behind him. At last, he said, almost to himself, "The river hides nothing, Watson. It carries the sins of men upon its surface until the current delivers them back to shore. Guilt is not washed away by flight, it merely changes its direction." The faint breeze stirred the reeds, carrying with it the scent of earth and rain. "Do you pity him, Holmes?" I asked. "I pity them both," he answered simply. "One for loving too much, the other for too late." We departed Kingsbury Dell the next morning beneath a sky cleansed by rain. The road curved gently upward, offering one last glimpse of the village, its steeple rising above the mist, its meadows once more blue with flowers. Holmes leaned back in the carriage, his eyes half closed in thought. After some time he spoke. "You see, Watson, intellect alone cannot govern the heart. The same logic that unmasks deceit is powerless against love. The heart, my dear Watson, can conceal its motives more cunningly than any criminal mind." I made no reply. The rhythmic clatter of wheels upon the road filled the silence between us. Holmes struck a match and lit his pipe, the smoke curling like a ghost about his face. As we passed beyond the valley, I glanced back once more. Justice had been done, yet there lingered no triumph, only a profound stillness, as though sorrow itself had been absorbed into the earth. And in that quiet, I felt that the tale of the Bluebell widow would live on. Not as crime, but as human frailty laid bare beneath the gentle hand of truth. As our carriage rattled away from Kingsbury Dell, Holmes sat in silence for some time, his gaze fixed upon the rolling fields dissolving into mist. At last he spoke, softly, as though thinking aloud. "You see, Watson, guilt is a curious companion. It may sleep for years, yet one kind word, or one remembered scent, is enough to wake it. The Bluebell widow sought to forgive, while her husband sought to forget. Neither understood that forgiveness and forgetting are enemies, not allies." He turned toward me, a faint glimmer of melancholy in his eyes. "It is a tragedy of the heart, my dear Watson, and the heart is the one mystery even I shall never wholly solve. And what about you, dear listener? What do you think was Captain Whitcomb's gravest mistake? His deception, his return, or the hope that love could ever erase the past? Share your thoughts below and tell me what lesson you take from this case. If you enjoyed unravelling another of Holmes's dark puzzles, don't forget to subscribe for more mysteries. and share this story with a friend who loves a quiet crime beneath the English moonlight.